Hi, everyone. Today, we'll be talking to Wren about their upcoming graphic novel, The House on Caple Hill. Check out the link in the description to watch the playlist of all of the podcasts we've recorded so far about this graphic novel. Last time, we had compared Joel with Laurel since they are the main characters of the second book of the series, the Book of Khet. This time, we'll be looking at two important characters of the first book, the Book of Khet, namely Claude and Peter. Claude was about to be married to Jo before she was whisked away, and Peter marries her after casting a spell on her. So, first question, who is Peter and what are his main personality traits?
Peter is the assumed identity of a creature called the Bakar, which is um, it's a dark fey creature. And this one in particular had been adopted by one of the Earl King's daughters, and she created Peter as kind of a persona for it to take on to try and convince others that he's human.
I
I'd say
see.
that his main character traits are he's youthful, but he's kind of bizarrely cynical for how youthful and energetic he is. I'd say that one of his main traits is his unpredictability. And he also has something of a sense of superiority as well.
I see. So I think like we talked about last time with Claude, Claude is a tiny bit arrogant. Would you say that Claude's more arrogant or Peter is?
I would say that Peter is definitely more arrogant. I think that Claude, while he does have moments of arrogance, I think part of it is because he knows that he has so much at stake if he lets down the mask, the curtain, whereas Peter legitimately believes that he's sort of better than everybody else.
Is it because of how he was raised, especially since, he has these powers and the Earl King is sort of a monarch, isn't he? And he's
He
related to
is.
him.
Yes. So his family of origin definitely had a part to play in his sense of superiority because they are Fey royalty. They are very powerful creatures. Everything in the vicinity is afraid of them, and for very good reason. And they're kind of accustomed to being entitled to that fear, amongst other things, whether that be from other Fey or from humans.
hmm What is Peter's goal in trying to brainwash Josephine into marrying him? What does he want to achieve through that?
It's definitely he perceives Josephine as kind of a trophy. And part of that is her counterpart Laurel is sort of the how should I put it? The most targeted prey of these dark fae. And he can see in Josephine that she's supposed to have this counterpart. And he figures that if as long as he can manipulate her under his power, she'll eventually take him to that source.
I see. So his main goal is Laurel. So he is trying to get Laurel through Josephine.
In a sense, although neither of them at that point know who Laurel is in relation to Josephine, and neither of them know Laurel at all.
True. So I guess she is just, one of the paths, well, one of the steps towards the goal that he is trying to ultimately reach. And what does he
Exactly.
want to do with Laurel exactly? Why do all the Dark Fae want to get her?
So Laurel is a being that is made out of a kind of life light. It's a very, you know, metaphorical, allegorical representation of um, an individual life spark. And those are very powerful. And um, those are the things that separate the living from the living dead. And that is like the most sought after, the most, um, how should I say? that is what feeds them in a sense. It's what keeps them going forever. And they can get that in smaller sources from other things, but to come across um, someone like Laurel is a much better source of um, that sustenance for them.
I see. Does Peter get any sustenance from being around Joe?
He does, in a sense. It's interesting because he kind of treats her the same way he would treat any of those other creatures, even though he understands that she doesn't have it, but she's supposed to have it. But he feeds off of her in other ways, like in the ways that he kind of um, manipulates her, and he's feeding off of her emotional health. And as that steadily declines, and as her psychological state are in decline, that's what he's feeding off of her from her. But because that's not even the understood quote unquote natural way of things, the way it usually goes, it's not healthy for either of them. Like, yes, Joe's absolutely being preyed on, but it's also not giving Peter what he needs to sustain this facade.
Right. So does his human facade start to fade?
It does at certain weak points when his fey nature overtake everything that he's had to sort of cake on and paste back together. There are these points when it cracks because he can't control himself.
Hmm. How does Peter push roles onto Josephine? In the podcast where we compared Claude and Josephine, we talked about how Claude is a gentle authoritarian. Would you say that Peter is not very gentle, and he is more authoritarian?
I would definitely agree with that assessment. He absolutely pushes Josephine to take on roles for him and do the things that he believes he's above doing because, he's better than everybody. Um, and, constantly and aggressively, he's pushing her to be all these things because he's manipulated her into thinking that's the only way she's worthy of being loved, for one thing, and unworthy of having a place in his esteemed family and in their lives. And he definitely takes advantage of the fact that while he targeted her, she didn't understand that. So he kind of frames it as, well, I saved you when you had nothing, when you popped out, from nowhere and went rambling on about things people didn't understand. I still helped you. And he uses that against her.
I see. How does Peter's family compare to Claude's family?
Um, Peter's family is, uh, they're very prejudiced, and they're very, there's got to be like another degree to classism in a sense, because they not only believe, there's classism with people as far as, you're second class and I'm first class, etc. But, that's already so far below their hierarchy as far as they're concerned that people are kind of cattle. Um, so none of them actually love one another. Like, they're not really a family. They're this collection of entities that are related in their own specific way, but they don't really feel things like love or affection. They don't have that for each other. Whereas, uh, because of how their hierarchy is structured, they're sort of Josephine's plight is kind of an amusement for them. It's oh, we're watching a sad play kind of thing and indulging in our son's bizarre whim.
Hmm.
There's no ethical, moral quandary.
Hmm.
Whereas Claude's family, as much as they might be secretive and come across as pretentious, they're actually very loving and very protective of each other because they understand that they have a particular burden to bear and that they're doing it for the sake of somebody else. whereas the Earl King and his lot just kind of do for themselves, and that's all they're worried about.
That makes sense. And this is why Claude is a more balanced person.
Yes, if anything, Claude, because he was the eldest son, had it drilled into him that this was his responsibility and this was on his shoulders, to keep things afloat and to keep his family unit working. So if anything, he is a very responsible, over responsible person. Kind of takes on too much because he already feels like it's expected of him.
And Peter doesn't take on that much because I guess his family doesn't really care because they're not a cohesive unit.
They're not a cohesive unit. He's another pet as far as most of them are concerned. Um, and yeah, they're all of that is just so below them. And but he wants to believe that he's high and mighty like the rest of them. So he believes that, you know, the things that it takes to make a relationship work or the things that it takes to be just human to one another are just beneath him.
Right. And also, it kind of counts that Peter is not biologically related to the Earl King, right? Because he is a foundling.
He is. He is. He's a creature that um we don't really know where he came from. It's sort of tossed about that he's either, just abandoned or perhaps sacrificed to the Earl King's clan for the safety of his own real parents. No one really knows, but it's again, he's more of a pet than anything else.
hmm Would you say that Peter is more worldly and more exposed to other people than Claude, or the other way around?
I would actually say that it's the other way around in the sense that Claude is more street smart. And while Claude may have come from a different place that wasn't necessarily quite the same as, Josephine's culture or time or whatever that may have been, he still understands how to put on an act and how to put on a front. And he's always lived alongside his fellow man, whereas Peter has lived a longer lifetime, but he lived that lifetime in isolation with very little human company except for the people that they caught and tormented in the woods, which is not a lot of exposure.
That's true. But Peter can fool people, right? Because when he first meets Josephine, he fools her.
He does. So, he is able to fool people because of the sort of armor or accessories that his adoptive mother created for him. One of which is his human appearance, and that's sort of it's, well, I'll figure out a way to explain that. But one of the things she gives him is this creature has a forked tongue, and she mends it together with a special magic and tells him very specifically that um this will help you speak in the way that men will listen to you. But and she gives him, a very fairy tale thing. She gives him a warning, just don't do this and it'll work fine. And what does he do? The one thing she tells him not to. And that's part of where things start to crumble apart, is because he can't sustain that armor, and he also is careless with it.
Right, because he's not well versed in the ways of man.
Exactly.
And his only motivation is to get, the sustenance, nothing else.
Exactly. So it's very circular reasoning, and that never ends well.
Right. So, what was Peter's first impression of Joe? How did it compare to Claude's first impression of Joe?
Um, Peter's first impression of Joe is very obsessive. Um, he's very struck because out she comes of this, she appears wherever she appears out of, and she's in a wedding gown with flowers all over her, the decadence, the mystery, the intrigue. Um, And for him, because he's so isolated and because he's so accustomed to only seeing people every once in a while and making that into a hunt, a chase, that is immediately what he does with her. But he understands that there is something about her that is different. And I think part of the implication there might be that because she has been displaced, that displacement leaves traces on her, and he senses that, but he doesn't know what it is exactly.
Hmm. How does that compare to Claude's first impression of Joe?
Claude's first impression of her is amusement. Just um he's too tickled to be even insulted that she's basically trespassing on his property. Um because he's never met someone who behaved so outside the norms in that way, in the way, and he recognizes that in her. So from the beginning, Peter immediately desires Joe in a very ownership sense kind of way. And but Claude immediately likes Joe, and that admiration and affection and that connection to her are what he wants to nurture.
Right. So one is definitely much more wholesome, and the other is quite frightening.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely quite a juxtaposition, those two sides of the same coin.
Hmm. What was Joe's first impression of Peter? How did it compare to her first impression of Claude?
So I I find it kind of ironic that her first impression of Peter is actually much more favorable than her first impression of Claude. Um, Whereas she first perceived Claude as kind of uptight, and she might have been a little bit afraid of him. Uh, she sees Peter as perhaps odd, but at least good intentioned. And she also tries to justify that with, I'm in a world that I don't understand. Maybe this is normal and I just don't know. She doesn't understand that because she's so far away from anything that she understands.
Hmm. And I guess Peter takes advantage of that, even though he doesn't really quite understand the implications of why she doesn't understand.
Yeah, you're absolutely right there. He does take advantage of that, particularly in the sense that he's kind of promised her that he's going to help her navigate this new world she's landed in, and doesn't know how to get along in by herself, or at least that's what he tells her. Um, yeah, so he definitely takes advantage of that.
How does magic affect Peter and how he sees the world and Joe? How does magic affect Claude and how he views the world and Joe?
So Peter's life has always involved magic or another. um, Down to his very blood. Even if he's not one of the Earl King's kin, he's still a Fae, and he still has, magic and power about himself that, um, while it's dark and warped, uh, it's perverted his understanding of right and wrong because of the input that he had on it. Um, Whereas, Claude's life in an interesting parallel has also always been revolved around magic in a sense. His family are magicians, and they have been privy to some very special and very powerful magical secrets that they have kept in their family through generations. So he has sort of an awe and a respect, whereas Peter perceives magic and what it can do for him and its role in his life as he's very entitled to that, whereas Claude sees in himself that he is responsible to that power instead of the other way around.
That makes sense. So Peter definitely is someone who is not driven by responsibility, but a sense of entitlement in all ways. And that filters down to how he sees magic.
Yes, absolutely. It is completely self-serving. um there's no consideration of consequences for himself, or for certainly not for anyone else. um he doesn't respect what it can do if it's let spiral, or what it really means for him if people realize what he is.
Hmm. Would you say that Joe's view of magic is closer to Claude's as she learns more about magic?
I would say that it is closer to Claude's. In her initial attempts at magic, she finds that she can't do it. She doesn't have it. And later we discover that that's partially because she is separated from her other selves. Um, Whereas we do see Laurel working some magics here and there in the Book of Khet. And, through Laurel, Joe does develop more of that understanding of, this is not something to be toyed with. This is not something that only serves me. This is not something that only affects me, the singular person. Um, it's it's a responsibility, and the reactions and the consequences that spring from it can land in multitudes of places you can never anticipate.
Hmm. Exactly. What are Peter's main flaws? What are Claude's main flaws?
Um, Peter's biggest flaw, I would say, firstly, would be his entitlement and his complacency, because as long as the system benefits him, he will never question it. He will never question its policies or consequences outside of himself, as long as it continues to benefit him. Um, Claude's biggest flaw is his fear, primarily his fear of judgment and consequence, and it reaches to a degree that for Claude it bars him from fully experiencing joy and from fully engaging with his own life.
I see. I think that's where his sense of responsibility also ties in, right? It's
It
because he's
is.
so obsessed with being judged that he becomes really obsessed with responsibility. And that's why he's always thinking about how to regulate his own life, and he never gains any joy as a result of that.
Yeah, and Josephine is one of the first people to teach him to choose joy over um, acceptance. And unfortunately, that kind of gets cut short.
Right, because of the spell that happens in the Book of Khet that
Yes,
separates them.
yes.
Right. So, do you think Peter has any redeeming qualities? Do they exist? What are Claude's most positive traits to compare?
Um, I would say that in a sort of loop around kind of way, like everything seems to be with Peter, his the quality that redeems him the most is ultimately his own loneliness, because he understands himself to be an other. And of course he would turn out twisted in the environment that he's been in. And that is lamentable. If he had just been, shown compassion and love, instead of this sort of passive tolerance, um, he could have turned out much, much better.
Mhm.
Um, and as for Claude, interestingly, I guess as a compliment to that, I would say that his finest quality is his compassion. Is that he looks for the pain in other people because he understands that, and that he's looking for how to help people.
True. And that's why Josephine is drawn to him because her own family, kind of similar to Peter's but less extreme, doesn't really care that much about her.
Yes, her family is pretty cold towards her, and they don't, they kind of put up with her strangeness as best they can, instead of helping her embrace it or embracing it about her herself. And Claude sees that. I think he sees that she's a person who, although she's incredibly special, has never been treated that way. And he wants to change that personally. Whereas Peter, on the other hand, sees her and he sees that reflection in her of, this is a person who is treated poorly. Well, I'm bigger than you now, so I'm going to treat you, the way I've been treated, which is poorly.
Mm, that makes sense. Yeah, because I think he has a more vengeful mentality, doesn't he?
He does. He does. He's a very bitter person.
Right. And he only gets redeemed later in the Book of Khet, I believe, right? No, no, later in the Book of
Um,
Ka.
in the
Did
Book
you
of
change it?
Ka,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
that part is going to happen in the Book of Ka, where Josephine builds a time machine and she travels back to the past, thinking that she can be there in time to save Claude, but it's the wrong past. But in that past, she finds Peter before he is taken by the Earl King and his daughters. And she gives him to a human family and says, I know that you want a family, and this can be just as good as long as you feed him good things, feed him love and feed him compassion, and then he'll be just fine. And sure enough, he is. And she runs into him later on with Laurel.
Right. And how is this alternative Peter like? How are his personality traits compared to the other version of him?
Because he he is again adopted, but he's instead adopted by somebody who wants to embrace him exactly as he is. And because he sees that that can be done, he understands that not everyone will understand, but he can at least try and show the others that he is not to fear,
Right.
um, not to be feared. And he also wants to, he sees himself in this setting as almost, uh, sorry, I'm searching for a word and I'm not finding it. He sees himself as something of, going up against the Earl King in his lot in a certain sense, because he perceives himself as, yes, I'm a fae, but I'm on the human side and I want to protect them.
Hmm.
So that is kind of what he offers Josephine when they meet, for the last time.
Right. So he has compassion.
Yes, he has
Right.
compassion.
And he's willing to use his magic for an actual purpose rather than just sustenance.
Exactly. He doesn't require that kind of sustenance, and he never was supposed to. He only did it because that's what he was taught how to do.
Right, because the Earl King, it was a tradition in their family to do that.
That's how they live, that's how they stay, immortal, and that's where their dark power comes from, is the destruction of light and hope. So
Hmm.
it makes sense for them, and it's, awful the way it is. Um, but they adopt him, and she just kind of picks him up. She doesn't exactly bother to say, what does this thing eat? You know, she just tells it to do the same that they do. And that's part
Mm,
of what twists him in
that's
that
true.
environment.
So basically, all of this stuff was for naught because it's not even for him in a sense. So I guess he never actually got the sustenance he's actually
Exactly.
required, right? Oh, sorry, there was a lag. I think I got cut off.
You did.
Yeah.
You said it was for naught because that's not even for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, he doesn't require that to live or to get by. He doesn't, that's not part of how he functions. That's not even what his type of fae is supposed to do.
Right, exactly. So yeah, it's great that Josephine found a new alternative future for him where he does get, the love and support he should have gotten.
Yeah, I think I wanted to, it was very important for me to make the point that no one is truly born a monster. And, not to leave Peter as a villain and a monster, and that's all he could ever be, but to kind of understand the duality within him that, yes, his story is tragic, but um, how our narrative is shaped, you know, is what path we get sent down, and each different path can make us a different person.
Right. Well, how about the Earl King's family? Are they truly monsters? Because I mean, I do understand that they choose to practice this kind of magic and suck out the light, but then that is their source of sustenance, right? So if they don't crush hope and suck out the light, will they even exist?
I think Well, I think that the argument could be made. However, I do think that in their case in specific, um, it's in a very it's in a very vampiric way. Like that's what's keeping them immortal. They should have just kind of phased out and turned into something else altogether ages ago. But they kept clinging to this version of themselves, and this version of themselves requires a specific um, rite, a specific ritual to stay extant, to stay in their plane. Otherwise, they could have, gone back into the whatever you want to call it, the karmic cycle, and evolved and become something else. So they've kind of perpetuated this and made monsters out of themselves.
Mhm. That makes sense. Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. I guess no one is really truly a monster. They could have just phased out themselves.
And it never had to be an end. It's a continuation of who they were supposed to be if they had let the course of the cosmos take its way.
Mhm. Yeah, that's it. That's all of our questions. I think we have a really clear understanding of the differences between Claude and Peter.
I'm glad you feel that way. This has been an immense pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have a great night.